So thank you for joining. And do you want to talk a bit about who you are, what you do, how you produce music?
Yeah, of course. My name's Tom. I'm an Ableton certified trainer. I spend a lot of my time, well, I spent most of my time in Ableton Live in some way, shape, or form. A lot of that involves working with artists in one-to-one capacity, helping with various things from setting up a live show to figuring out problems with live. And then I also run a company called ELPHNT, where I make a bunch of content for Ableton that is video tutorials, Macs for live devices, sample packs, presets, all that sort of thing. I do occasionally try to actually make music as well in between. I've got numerous different projects that I work on, a solo project called Console, a group project called Later Takayama. So all kinds of fun with Ableton Live.
I've been aware of your stuff for a long time. I really admire your tutorials and the stuff you've done for many, many years. One of the things that kind of prompted me to kind of get in touch and talk about generative stuff, you had this video where you were talking about using generative ideas in live to generate, not a song as such, but to generate ideas that you could then kind of mine and look for the good stuff. Do you want to talk a little bit about that general process?
Yeah. So for me, that kind of comes from the fact that and maybe it's some imposter syndrome, but I feel like I'm really bad at writing music. If you told me to sit down and say, come up with a melody, come up with a chord progression, I'm okay with like kind of rhythmic stuff because I'm a drummer. But even then, sometimes I sit down and I'm just like, this is boring and uninteresting. So over the years, I kind of developed various ways of working that let me function more as a curator than a creator, is how I sort of see it. And there's this whole bucket of kind of generative techniques that just create ideas. Some are bad, some are good. But I think the biggest benefit is that it's easy to create a lot of stuff really quickly. And then I can go in and say, that's rubbish, get rid of it. That's really good, keep that, make it a bit, and then do that over and over and just generate a lot of material to choose from. And to apply that in almost every aspect of music production, from coming up with this initial ideas, melodies, harmonies, chords, that sort of thing, all the way to sound design. So rather than just having a blank slate and sitting there staring at the screen, there's a little something to kind of go with. And then that sort of extends through the whole process. Probably my most, of all the sort of tools that I've made, the one that I use and maybe lean on a little too much is a tool I made called Inspire, which is somewhat like the godfather of generative technique. Brian Eno's oblique card is inspired that concept. It's basically just the Max device and you within it, and it gives you a random musical suggestion. Turn up the volume, slow down the tempo, use distortion, whatever. I should do a little more thinking about, okay, what makes sense here? But a lot of the time I'm like, I don't know what to do. Just hit that, whatever it tells me to do, cool, I'm going to do that kind of thing. So that shows up in every single aspect of the production process. But I think the key thing, which you touched on, is the idea isn't necessarily to have a finished final piece of music. We just hit generate and whatever comes, that's it. It's generating, I like to think of it as like food, seeds of things that can be manipulated or changed or used in different contexts to create a bigger idea. I've got an ELPHNT pack called Gen, which is all about that sort of thing where I found myself one day sitting down and just kind of flicking through presets and I'm like, I don't really like any of these and it's a bit random. What if I just had something that I could click a button that just gave me a preset with some sort of parameters constraint? Also similar to that is another tool called Drummer, which is that same kind of concept but for percussion. It uses field recordings as the source, and it's set up in such a way that you can just click in, enable the macro randomization button. You can click that, and it gives you a new percussion sound.
Yeah. I mean, there's several things you talked about there that I'd like to unpack a little. In those sound design tools, there's a key part to that though, which is, although you're randomizing, it's not randomizing every parameter across its full value. You've kind of curated the range of possible things that you might want to randomize to an extent that you'll always get pads, or you'll always get leads, or you'll always get something that's plucked. So that in itself is really sweet, because it's taking you somewhere new, but that's kind of curated and kind of structured so that it's never, a completely mad off the wall sound and utterly different from the last thing you had, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the key is kind of randomization with constraints. And what's interesting, as you were sort of thinking about that, I was maybe giving myself a bit of grace on the bad at writing things or bad at sound designing things part, because there's sort of a degree of like, you do have to know the parameters you want to stick within. But like, what are the parameters that make up a good sound? When you're doing that random sound design, you know what ranges, generally speaking, are going to work. When you're generating a melody, if you stick it within a key or a certain grouping of notes, that they're going to work in a certain way. Yeah, so there's definitely that sort of curated control of the randomization.
When a few people have tried out the kinds of methods I've been talking about, one of the things that I hear back a lot is, I tried something generative once and I really didn't like what I got because it was just all over the place. I couldn't get anything musical out of it. But again, that's talking about curating the settings, or putting constraints on it so that it's in a scale, or your values don't go from C-2 to C8. You're kind of squishing things within a sensible range. Also, I guess that thing of, you press random and you get something. If you don't like it, press random again and you'll get a new thing, right? So you don't have to commit to, the first thing I didn't like it, but I've got it now.
Yeah, exactly. It's that process of curation and just really knowing what's good, what's not, what you like, what you don't. And also being fairly ruthless with just kind of chucking out stuff that you don't like. Because the other problem that can come with all of this generative stuff is a little bit of like overwhelm of too much. Because once you sort of get past the like, okay, I'm not going to just use the first thing, I'm going to use the next one. What happens is you hit random again and you think, I quite like this sound. If I hit random again, could I have a better sound?
Yeah.
And you hit that, you think, this is good, but could I have a better? And then 200 sounds later, the one that was probably the best, you've jumped over. So there's also a certain degree of just kind of getting to a point and saying, cool, but it's something, it's good enough, it's what I want, and then sort of taking that in a direction. Yes.
Do you keep that little kernel all the way through the production? Or do you sometimes get to the end and go, that was just there to get me going. Actually, now I don't need that thing. I can kind of toss it.
Yeah, it very much ends up being that latter one where either the original idea evolves and changes into something totally different, or it does end up like disappearing entirely. It's always about just getting that initial spark going.
Getting past the blank page.
Yeah, exactly. Just getting off the sort of cold start problem of just having nothing, but actually having something, and then it pushes you in a direction. And whether that thing actually sticks around is kind of immaterial.
And actually, that there's a whole separate discussion that I've heard about generative art versus AI art. And you could kind of see something similar here, that generative to me means you curate certain attributes and you kind of bake in things that might work. And you generate something, but then you can go, well, okay, that's good. I'll store that, but I'll generate another one and that one might be better. Whereas AI seems to me to be kind of, it's similar in that you're getting away from a blank page, but it's kind of approaching it from a different angle. I think, in that you've got less control over that curation and the constraints, except through your prompt, right?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because it's called generative AI is what most of these things are, what they refer to it as.
Yeah.
So, I mean, generative in the literal sense of the word of it is generating something, not in the Brian Eno sense of the generative word. But it's interesting that you bring up AI, because I find that the way I tend to use various sort of AI tools that I've explored over the last couple of years is in exactly that sort of similar way. And I think in many aspects, I've been kind of preparing myself for AI for many years, because the ethos of all of this generative, or at least the way I use generative stuff, is to have a creative companion. I do a lot of solo stuff, and then I work in collaborations a lot. And I tend to use the generative techniques less, not at all, but a lot less in collaborative environments, because you have somebody else to bounce off of. So that seed of an idea can come from someone else. Whereas, when I'm sort of by myself, especially kind of as a modern music producer, where you have to do everything, you have to write the chords and the rhythm, etc. It's useful to have that extra companion to just give you something to bounce off of. AI is, in a way, exactly the same thing, just manifested in a different form. It's just a little companion. You can tell it what to do in a little more detail than you can tell a MIDI generator what to do. At least it's the same concept, just a lot more broad than a very specific kind of thing. Around when I was working on my console album, I was playing around with a lot of newer sort of generative music tools. I haven't kind of lost interest in them a bit since then. But at the time, the way I was using them was exactly that of chucking a prompt, spit out some sound, probably wouldn't end up using that piece of sound in the final piece, but it would give me something to start with. It would be a rhythm in there that I would bounce off of and add chords on top of, or a melody that I could extract and sort of spin into a different kind of direction.
Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of like analogies. So you might go, here are all the diamond cards, pick any of the diamond cards, whereas AI is, here's all 52 cards. Pick from those.
All of Magic the Gathering cards from all of time, all thousands of different ones. Pick from all of these. It's a lot more vast.
How are you generally making music now? Are you mostly in Ableton, or do you use hardware gear and that kind of stuff?
Pretty much exclusively in Ableton. Over the years, I've acquired and let go of various pieces of hardware. So sitting here looking at it, I've got a Make Noise No Coast. And literally the other day I was thinking of I think I just sell it because I hardly ever use it. The thing for me with hardware is I'm very much about workflow. Workflow kind of defines my process the most. And for me, I like to have everything that I'm going to use in one place.
Right.
And so having Ableton Live on my laptop with a curated collection of all the devices that I use, that's just works easier for me. So I kind of go in there, I can be on a train, I can be at home, I can be wherever, and I know it's just all going to be there. I find my approaches when those things crop up and I can play with them and create little sound banks or samples and stuff, grab them and bring them in. The core workflow is all just Ableton Live and then the push as well as a controller. And I do a lot of, I work a lot with field recordings and bring in things from the outside, but all the tools themselves all sit inside of Ableton.
Your curated Max for Live set of stuff is fantastic, because that's things you've tried and tested, right?
Yeah. So the thing with that is I'm very, very particular about the tools that I use. And so even to the degree of I don't even use third-party plugins just because they annoy me for various different reasons. I can't consolidate them into my project. I've moved computers one too many times and had missing plugins, or collaborate with people and something's missing. I've had enough experiences that I don't like plugins. So Max for Live very much became a way for me to create all those things that I wanted. And because what's funny is I love hardware. I love tape and analog distortion effects. And I want all of those sounds, but I want the workflow of Ableton Live.
Yeah.
But the curated collection is not all of those devices are in regular rotation. A lot of them I've maybe used and they've fallen out of rotation. There's also the idea of it's a thing I have to consider when looking at devices to add to the curated collection is sometimes a device will come along that I think doesn't really work for me. I know it's a good device and other people are going to really kind of love it. So there's definitely a handful of devices in there that are ones that I don't use regularly, but I've sort of tested and know that they are going to be good for somebody.
And it amazes me that there's things like the MIDI Snake Max for Live device, that someone has gone to the bother of trying to make a Max for Live device that pretty much emulates that hardware is really super cool, right? Because then, as you say, you can just pick it up, drag it, drop it into Live, and you're off and running.
I think my guess is it comes from that same impulse that I have of wanting the workflow of having everything in one place. And so you've got this piece of gear that you maybe love, but it's not inside your computer. So Max just kind of lets people build that, which is cool.
I think also things like that, for me, they open up much closer to like the modular experience. You know, I tinkered with some modular stuff once or twice, and it frustrated me to the point that I was like, okay, I'm going to go back to Max for Live. What modular does really nicely is to separate pitch and gate. You know, so you don't have to have the MIDI note on, note off. So you have both pitch and starting point. So that kind of MIDI snake device has both pitch on one of the panes, but it doesn't have gate on another, I think. So that you can get that combination of weird patterns that come out because it's not a kind of standard sequencer.
You can you get much more granular control over each component, and then you could do interesting things like set the gate sequence and the pitch sequence to different lengths and get interesting generative polymeters and melodies that kind of create themselves, which is pretty fun. It's always, sort of intrigued me about Max in particular is that there is that strong connection to the modular world, and that there's a lot of kind of creativity in the modular world in terms of just people thinking of weird, wacky, wonderful ideas. And for whatever reason, I don't know why that doesn't exist in the plugin world. Again, another reason why I'm not a huge fan of plugins is plugin manufacturers just seem to want to give you, here's another compressor and here's another EQ that does the same thing. I guess it's maybe some commercial considerations there. Whereas Max has that same ethos that modular has. It's like, I'm going to make this thing not because I'm going to sell 100,000 copies, but because it's cool and it's going to be a fun and creative tool. So you do get all kinds of weird and wonderful Max devices that just would never exist as plugins. I mean, as far as I know, there's no VCV rack, obviously, but there's no like plugin version of the MDD Snake or any of the interesting literal hundreds of weird and wonderful generative Max devices that exist.
Yeah. I think also it's nice to see in Live 12 that people like Philip Meyer are building these MIDI generator tools. You know, so that is getting closer as well to new ways of creating sequences or messing sequences that are already there and doing clever stuff. It's brilliant. I think it's amazing how Live has opened the door in that sense to say you can bend time, stuff like that, you know.
I mean, the MDD Snake Max device also exists now as a MIDI tool. So instead of having the real-time generation, which I kind of prefer it as a real-time sort of generative thing to the MIDI tool, but it's kind of cool to have it as an option. I mean, the thing that I've always loved about Ableton and what's kept me using Ableton and drew me to Ableton initially is it's interesting because sort of in my work as a trainer, I do a lot of like beginner workshops, introducing people to Ableton. And there's always this question of like, why Ableton? Why would I use Ableton versus Logic or Pro Tools or anything? And the answer that I always give is, for me, what really sets Ableton Live apart from other DAWs is other DAWs are just there to capture your idea. You come up with your idea somewhere else. They obviously come from that old school mentality of the studio, and the ideas happen somewhere else and you're just getting them down to tape. Whereas Ableton is actually, it's an instrument, really. It helps you come up with those ideas. Obviously, it does all the capturing of the ideas as well, which is convenient. But it's helping you generate and come up with ideas and functions like an instrument. So every time there's a new version of Ableton and the new features that they add, it's like plugging some other little thing onto your guitar and your instrument just gets that much more interesting and can do all these weird and wonderful things, which is really, really cool. And then they all become not just like kind of technical capturing features, but interesting creative features that you can bend to come up with like totally new ideas, which is great.
I think having seen interviews with Ableton developers and staff there, one of the big things that comes out is that an awful lot of them are actually musicians as well as developers. That is a good thing because, just as you're saying, many of them are saying, how can I use this tool in new creative ways to make music that I want to create?
And going back to what I was saying earlier about the sort of similarities between Eurorack and between modular and Max for Live, the people who are developing those tools, they come from a need as a music maker. Most Max devices, probably all Max devices, come because someone was sitting somewhere making music and they thought, oh, I'd really love to have XYZ. I know like every single Max device I've made is because I sit down and I think I would love to have this. Whereas maybe with VST plugins, and I won't name any company names, but I'm sure there's a marketing department somewhere saying we need another compressor because people buy compressors. So let's make this compressor. So there's less, it feels like there's less of that creativity. It's not entirely missing. There are lots of really creative plugins that exist. It's not as diverse as something like Max.
For me, it's not, I don't want to program in Max for Live because it's too close to my day job. I want to try to keep that a wee bit at arm's length. But the fact that it's there, and as you say, you can access bits even behind the scenes in Ableton and intercept messages and intercept signals and do all kinds of amazing things with it. It's just awesome.
Yeah. If you think about some of the generative tools that exist in Max, what are some of your go-tos there, Max devices that you just always go to generative stuff?
They're probably split into buckets. So there's kind of MIDI generators, and there's a whole slew of devices that will push out a stream of MIDI notes that you can do things with. Or I tend to couple those with the built-in MIDI effects and MIDI transformers, just to try to then constrain that into something that is relatively musical, or to take what's coming out. Often I've got one track that's kind of close to the original MIDI sequence source, and then I take that to drive other parts. So I might use note length and an arpeggiator to create an arp part, and then take the output of that and use note length again, and that could become a pad sound. But then that means that, like, whatever is coming out of that generator, whatever system I'm using, the other parts are related to that. So if that goes somewhere, I know that those other parts are going to go with it because they're all kind of tied in together.
The fun concept is sort of having your single source of randomization, if you will, and then everything stems from that.
Yeah. The other big place that I use Max for Live is kind of in, and it's a little bit non-obvious in that it is through devices like LFO, which is Max for Live, but it's now part of the kind of suite. So there's lovely modulation devices that will either control values or modulate or allow you to do fun stuff with those.
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of non-obvious place to go for generative ideas, particularly around sound. Like, I know I use a lot of the modulators for generative sound design. Even if it's like, I think of the most simple example that I probably use in almost every single track, a hi-hat sample. Let's say I want a short kind of closed hi-hat sample. What I'll do is I'll load up an open hi-hat sample, pull the decay down, and then just put a real subtle LFO on the decay. So there's just kind of the hi-hats opening and closing a little bit that just adds some sort of variation. And I think it was in Live 12, they updated the LFO with the stray wave shape, which is great because it's just sort of like an organic kind of slightly random sine wave. So there's lots of fun ways to sort of use modulation there. The one device that I made, Steps, this is the step sequence modulator, that also kind of came from loving that sort of concept with the LFO where you kind of get these smooth modulations, but then wanting more rhythmic modulation. So having a step modulator, but being able to set the length so that it's a 7 cycle sort of hard pattern. So it repeats off the grid and has a somewhat kind of rhythmic nature to it, but repeats in different ways. And then of course, you can get even more fun there when you start mapping those modulators to the MIDI effects that you're using to generate things. You're having the pitch kind of change in random ways or as it's being generated and recorded somewhere.
Yeah.
Those modulation devices are a real fun source of
And
generative.
I'll even use some of those modulators and the Max for Live devices with push, so that, like with expression control, so that when I play something on push, by sliding fingers or by pressing harder, it will modulate like the rate of an ARP or something like that, or the level of something, or open a filter. And that adds a lot of possibility.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the expression control itself is always quite a fun device to go to, because it does have one of the sources is random. So like every time you play a new note, it just generates a random signal and it can do something interesting. The other thing I thought of, though, as you were mentioning live performance, is something I haven't explored enough. I have explored a little bit, but probably not as much as it could be, is generative in a live performance context. Think of something like follow actions in Ableton. You've got a performance set up in the session view, using follow actions where you have them slightly kind of randomized. So maybe have an arrangement structure that you're playing through, but different parts are going to come in at different times and kind of keep you on your toes. Again, kind of going back to that concept of so sometimes I think of Ableton as an intelligent accompanist, in the way that when you're jamming with a band, always know what your bandmate's going to do. They're going to follow a rough kind of musical structure, but they might throw in a little lick or do something different. And so, so you can, in a live performance context, you can use follow actions to set up something unexpected to happen. And then you've got to respond to that and make things more kind of fun and alive.
It's choose your own adventure.
Yeah, exactly. Bit of improv jazz. Coming.
Yeah, with an unpredictable bandmate. The tools that I think are available now are really transformative. I call myself the lazy producer because I use these tools to start tracks. I often use them to just kind of let things go all the way through the track and leave it to chance to see what comes out with those constraints that we talked about earlier. The other part of that is every time it plays through, I'm never quite sure what I'm going to get. And that's both a blessing and a curse. Sometimes it can be fantastic, but other times I get something I like and then I can't recreate it later.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important part that we haven't maybe mentioned enough, is the idea of capturing your generations. Is such an important part of any generative process, unless you are generating something purely for the moment that exists then and there. But if you want to use any of the things that you're generating in more of a controlled, curated way, is always be capturing.
Yeah, absolutely. And capturing, I've learned capturing at various levels, so capturing the original, but also capturing anything that's transformed. So that you don't lose it. Basically anywhere you've got a random anything going on, you need to somehow make sure that it's recorded into something.
Exactly.
Well, thanks so much for chatting to me, and I appreciate your input.
Of course. Yeah. It's fun to just nerd out for a bit.